to a brand new edition of Monster Power In-Depth. This time around we feature Marty Garza, creator of the Overkill legacy that was carried on over the years by several drivers, now carried on by Mikey Vaughters II in Overkill Evolution. And this interview is about 8 or 9 months old. It took a while to collect all the material for it, so I want to thank Marty for what he gave us as far as photographs. I also thank him a lot for his time, and a big thanks to Jason Davis for the never-before-seen video footage that he provided from his personal collections. You're going to want to stick around for that. This interview jumps around on the timeline a lot, so if you can bear with us there, but it is full of information, covered a lot of ground in it, and I really hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, here is Marty Garza.
How did you get into four-wheel drive, and how did that lead you to building Overkill?
It came as a progression. I actually started building lifted street trucks back when I was in high school, and just kind of became sort of an obsession for me. The lifted trucks, I started doing car shows and things like that. Was pretty successful in that, and I had a 1981 Bronco that I built, and it kept getting progressively bigger. Got a 460 with a 671 blower, and just kept going. And then I eventually decided that I wanted to put 2.5 tons and 48s under it. I ended up buying a set of 48s and aluminum Midwest wheels, and was kind of underway on doing that. Actually, at that time, I was helping Gabriel Montes with Texas Armadillo. We kind of crossed paths and hit it off. I was kind of being his crew guy occasionally for shows, and he was helping do the swap over on the Bronco. And somewhere along the line there, I ended up meeting Mike Vaughters, and he fell in love with the 48s and aluminum wheels, and talked me into doing a swap with him for a set of 5 tons with Clark Planetaries. So that sort of set the stage for doing a full-on monster truck instead of just doing a progression of the street truck. That then, I guess, within a short period of time, led to the construction of Overkill 1.
And Overkill 1 was, at the time, very vastly different from any truck out there. Not only the obvious suspension things you did, but the metal tubing that you used, or the sheets that you used to build the actual main rails for that chassis, weren't they?
Yeah, it was a little bit different. At that time, of course, monster trucks were each were pretty unique. It wasn't quite like today, where we've kind of all gone sort of in a very similar direction. At that time, you were seeing all different shapes and sizes of monster trucks. Everybody kind of had their own thing, and of course, Bob Chandler and Bigfoot and Everett Jasmer and USA 1, Jack Willman, Fred Schaefer. Those guys were pretty much the pioneers, and they kind of laid the groundwork that gave everybody kind of a little bit of direction. But from there, everybody put their own little twist on it. About that time, when I was getting started, was when monster truck racing kind of came into play, and that was obviously something that really interested me. I'm a pretty competitive person, so the racing side of it was what really intrigued me. And honestly, at the time, I saw what everybody was doing, and I felt that there was room for significant improvement. So I kind of decided that I wanted to do something different than what was out there. I didn't really think Leaf Springs was the way to go, and I really believed in a 4-link design and weight distribution. At that time, we didn't have the ability to tune suspension quite to the degree, of course, that we have now. So weight placement and everything was a little more critical. So that kind of pushed the design in a certain direction. We didn't have the level of sophistication in the chassis designs either. You know, at that time there were no tube chassis trucks or anything. Everything was straight frame rail stuff. So that was sort of, I guess, the evolution of the straight frame truck was maybe just the very beginnings of what ultimately became tube chassis trucks.
What was the material you actually used for building your main rails on that first truck?
It was like a shipping steel. It's a high tensile C channel. It was not a box tube truck. So, you know, at that time, I'd say the state of the art around that period was like a 2.5 ton frame. That was fairly popular at that time. You know, the progressions of monster truck chassis kind of went from the stock frame to beefed up, you know, extra plating added to the stock frames, and then eventually we reached the point where they were using C-channel, you know, military frames. So there were not very many. My memory's a little foggy on this, but I'm going to say there weren't a whole lot of trucks that were actually fabricated frames yet. Most were using military or truck frames at that time. So this was my, I guess, shot at trying to do something a little different. I wanted something that was stronger, but then I was, how can we take some weight out of it? Although it may not seem like it, I was trying to make the thing as light as possible. Which you see that a lot more on Maximum Overkill. You know, I learned a lot from Overkill 1, and then, you know, when Maximum came along, it was a pretty big jump.
And what was the major, other than lightening up, what was the major step in design for Maximum Overkill, and what was kind of the direction that you were going with that chassis?
Well, the big progression that happened about that time was the introduction of what I guess you could say was, in effect, more or less a monster truck specific coilover. Prior to that, a lot of people may not realize, but prior to that, all the trucks used, you know, standard shocks, you know, typical, you know, Tenneco type emulsion shocks. Some used, you know, gas shocks. Overkill 1 used Deutsch-Tech shocks that were the longest shocks I could find, with the airbags and everything. The thing had about 14 inches of travel, but it was not very controllable. Airbags are not really ideal for that. The spring curves on those are kind of funky, and they don't lend themselves to a really good progression. But and it used a Deutsch-Tech shock that gave me a little more travel than I think that about that time period, the longest normal shocks you would find were about 12-inch travel. And these were a little bit longer. But around that time, Custer Company released an 18-inch travel version of their off-road racing shock. That kind of came about as, to give you a little bit of background on that, Lance King worked for Custer Company. Custer Company used to build these very accurate equipment for oil wells and rigs, and they'd build these little fixtures that would look kind of looked almost like a bullet. They would shoot down into the pits to try to, I guess, measure depth and pressure and stuff. Well, Lance King was friends with Walker Evans, and back at that time, even the off-road race trucks used conventional shocks. They used shocks that you'd find on normal street trucks, and you know, obviously in the conditions of running off-road, they're cycling so fast they would overheat to where the point where they had the trucks set up to where the shocks were pinned, where they could pull in the pits, pull the pins, take the shocks off, put new shocks on, and keep going. Well, Custer Company or Lance King looked at this and said, you know what, I can come up with something better. We need more volume and everything. So Lance designed this shock that was a bigger volume shock and had more adjustability. Well, that, they were introduced into the off-road world, and not too long after that, they built longer and longer versions and came out with an 18-inch travel version that was really designed for monster truck use. So once those things were released, we looked at them and said, hey, this looks like it's the direction to go. So I designed a truck with 18 inches of travel that was kind of designed around that shock design for improved suspension. And then at the same time, by that point, the racing and all had reached a point where I said, we definitely need to be concerned about engine placement, trying to keep the truck as low, center of gravity as low as possible, trying to work on a little bit better geometry for the way the truck, trying to adjust the way the truck handled. And also, so I say there are a lot of little things I guess we sort of take for granted now because the trucks have gotten so sophisticated. But at that time, it was they were pretty unique pieces. It was a big jump in technology from the typical leaf spring truck. All of a sudden, we had these coilover trucks that had this amazing new capabilities.
And just from yours, because you didn't technically, I guess, run a leaf sprung monster truck, but from the first Overkill to maximum Overkill, just the ride from the shock, how much smoother was it, and what was that like to make that jump?
It was a pretty big jump. Now, although I didn't own myself a leaf spring truck, I did ride in a lot of them.
Right.
I was friends with Gabriel Montes, so I did several crushes in Texas Armadillo and with Steve Hess in Nightmare, with Mike Lauder's Black Stallion,
Jerry.
Barefoot, and I even Jeff Dean in King Kong 1. So I had a pretty good familiarity with them and saw their strong points and their weak points. Definitely the jump to the 18-inch travel and more so than there's a big difference between just wheel travel and then also the ability to have control over that travel, and the quality of the travel is really important. Well, it was a big jump. I guess I can give you an example. Black Stallion, if you remember back then, Mike's modification of Black Stallion, he added airbags with Custer shocks instead of coilovers, and the truck worked very well. It was a big jump, and it was just the ability to adjust damping. So it wasn't necessarily that he increased a lot of travel, but just the fact that he had the ability to tune it made a big difference.
Now, at that time also, you spent a lot of, at least the TV time, out of the driver's seat of that truck, so you were constantly willing to turn that driver's seat over. Why did you choose the people you chose, and how do you felt they did, especially during that 92 Penda season?
That wasn't actually entirely by design. When I ran Overkill 1 until Maximum was built, and then I was behind the wheel of Maximum, and Jerry Richmond, who helped a lot in the construction and all, was driving Overkill 1. One week, we completed a show. We went back to the shop, and I think I had ripped the rear steering or something off the housing in the back, and we had to make a bunch of repairs that week. And of course, they're like always, you're under the gun to get to the next event. So we're rushing to get things loaded up in the hauler and get the trucks loaded. And my trailer had a loft up in the front of the trailer over the tires, and I loaded my nitrogen tank up in there and turned around to climb out of the trailer, and the nitrogen bottle fell out of loft right onto my foot. And just about broke my foot, smashed my foot really bad. Fortunately, I was wearing steel-toe boots. It didn't hurt me, didn't take my foot off, but it hurt pretty bad. And I was out of commission. There's no way I could drive the truck that week. So Jerry actually took over driving Maximum that weekend, and did really well with it. Once I was recovered enough, I got back in the truck, and I finished out the Thunder National Series that year in Maximum. But by the summer, I got married shortly after the end of the Thunder National, first quarter series.
Right.
And over the summer, we were moving into a new home, and there was just a lot going on at that time. And the trucks were pretty busy at that time. So I said, you know what, this is the time I need to probably put Jerry in there and focus on the stuff I have going on here at home. Not too long after that, I hired Jeff Cook, who was, friends of ours as well. I hired Jeff Cook to drive Overkill 1. And, together there was a really good combination. They were good drivers, very capable of leaving them on their own. I didn't have to, be micromanaging them. I could pretty much turn them loose, and they could keep everything going and keep the trucks maintained. So it worked out well. When the team was ready to expand, we were getting ready to start on Extreme Overkill, is when I hired Steve Hess. The plan was, at that time, was that I was going to build Extreme Overkill, and Jerry was going to be in Extreme, and Steve Hess was going to be in Maximum. But then, we had the fire and lost the trucks, and then everything we had to, that set us way back, and all of a sudden we had to regroup and figure out, okay, what are we going to do? Things went downhill from there, and that, resulted in us regrouping, building Extreme, because I had so much time invested in the design. It was in hindsight, it wasn't the smartest thing in the world to do, because by that time we had Maximum pretty well refined. The thing was very reliable, very fast, and it did a really good job in all different types of environments. Well, I guess my ambition clouded my vision. So when we came back from the fire, I decided to build Extreme instead of building another Maximum. And Extreme was a pretty complex piece. It took a lot of time to work out the details of it. Being a swing arm truck and all. I had 32 inches of travel in the front, about 38 in the rear. Getting it to handle good, getting enough damping in it, just all the different things that it took to get that truck to work well was just a bit much, and it was initially not very reliable. We had driveline issues and things like that we had to work through, because there were really there were maybe 2 or 3 trucks that had that level of suspension travel at the time. So there were things that we had to work through, and it was probably not the most, in terms of the team, financially, it probably wasn't the best thing. I would have been better off building probably 2 Maximums, and they would have easily paid for Extreme. They just, I wanted to go racing, and I wanted the fastest thing I could build. Not necessarily, I wasn't looking at reliability. I was thinking speed, and like I said, in hindsight, that wasn't the best decision.
Now, you mentioned Steve Hess. You had a hand in that Nightmare truck that Kirk got, correct?
Right. Nightmare, when we, in 91, the end of the season, and we decided that we were going to, move on with Maximum. Steve was, really good friend of ours also, and he knew that he was going to have a harder time being competitive in the new season with the existing, steel body truck that he had. So everything was kind of starting to go towards the lighter weight race truck stuff. So he asked Jerry Richmond to build yet another truck for him. Jerry had built his previous truck, so he asked Jerry Richmond to build it, and Jerry said sure. And so, in effect, Nightmare and Maximum were kind of built side by side in the shop. They used a little bit different designs. Obviously I invested more time in the CAD design of Maximum, but a lot of those same principles were kind of used on Nightmare, just not. It didn't have quite the low CG stuff and all that, but it was still. Keep in mind that at that time, like 106s and that kind of stuff were relatively. They were not the first trucks with it, but they were relatively new. They were not. For us, we didn't know a whole lot about them. We were kind of experimenting to some degree.
Now, they also, and I had talked to you about this before, there were copycats of Maximum out there.
Oh, yeah. Many. Yes, many of them. It was amazing. The truck, again, it was pretty revolutionary. At the time, I think people didn't really quite realize why things were done the way they were. Today, we're much more accustomed to seeing engines that you can see the engine down underneath the truck. But at that time, there weren't many, if any. In other words, and we used to, get asked that a lot. Hey, how come you can see the engine under the truck? And it looks kind of weird. It doesn't really look like a truck. Because everybody, and keep in mind that this was a progression from street trucks. In other words, at that time, monster trucks were truly the descendants of big street trucks. So, and the original builders were trying to keep that, as much of that original, appearance, kind of trying to make them look like big trucks. And somewhere along the line, we kind of crossed over where we started building these things that were actually monster trucks. They were not big street trucks anymore. They started taking on a little bit of a different appearance, and the chassis started hanging down into the truck more, and the engine started getting lower, and engine placement started shifting around. And some of it was out of necessity. You say, okay, you're going to build something that's got a lot of wheel travel, and now all of a sudden placement of the transfer case and drive lines in there start having an effect on the overall design, and so it didn't happen overnight, but definitely the trucks kind of branched off, and it's sort of like natural selection. Certain things work and other things don't, and the things that didn't work didn't last very long in competition and kind of faded away or were replaced by things that did. And little by little, the trucks started looking a little more consistent. There was more consistency in the designs. Not necessarily every detail of them, but they started resembling each other a lot more because, again, those certain designs seemed to be more efficient.
Now, to go back to Extreme Overkill, what were some of the more specific design characteristics of that truck, at least, that were put into it to make it stick? Because that truck, I remember, when it landed, it did stay down pretty well.
Yeah, that truck was designed specifically for the Penda series. At that time we were racing. Penda series was straight line drag racing, and the course was pretty much the same course every week, so we knew what we were working with. And just from kind of being observant and watching what worked and what didn't work, I looked at things that, like, for example, looking at the trucks leaving the line. Back at that time, most of the trucks were under 145-inch wheelbase. A lot of them were on the shorter end. They were closer to 140. Well, the Maximum was actually a little longer at 145. There weren't a lot of trucks that long. But I was looking at like where the tires would sit in the starting line, because for those that may not be real familiar, when we were running Penda and you had a lot of really high horsepower trucks, we would dig some pretty impressive holes on the starting line. I mean, these things would dig down, and so traction was critical. I mean, when we started, kind of splitting hairs on the times, where the times were really, really close. So every little advantage you can find is well worth, investing investing some thought into. So one of the things that I thought was, I need to get the tires out of where the other guys are. I need to, play around with wheelbase and try to find better traction. And so that played into it. Also, the wheel travel it's a lot easier to make a truck that's got a lot of travel when you've got more room to work with. The links can be longer, and you don't have all these deflection issues. And because what happens is if you do a lot of travel with a shorter truck, not only do driveline issues pop up, but you've also got a lot of roll steer issues because the links, there's so much deflection in the link bars and all that it starts making the trucks unstable. And I was trying to build something that would go as straight as at all possible and try to stay as low as well. That's why it had so much wheel travel. I was never myself a big fan of linkage systems like a cantilever or anything like that because they're very difficult to design and still have a good progressive spring rate or damping curve. If you graph out what they do, they're not linear. They don't have a consistent progression. You can actually have portions that will be progressive to a point, and then beyond that point, they start to become digressive. And to me, swing arm is pretty straightforward, and that's why if you look at the vast majority of trophy trucks and all that, and even if you look at the front ends that are not four-link, they're independent front suspension, but the way those shocks are mounted on the A-arms are essentially the same thing as a swing arm, and it's still a motion. It's got a consistent motion ratio, and they're engineered for this. So, I definitely was inspired by those designs to kind of come up with something that was more practical in terms of achieving long travel. Because there are a lot of factors, and it's probably too much to go over in one interview like this, but keep in mind that we were also trying to keep the shock towers down. We didn't want to have, shocks sticking through the hood and things like that. We've progressed. The trucks look a little bit different. We've learned different ways to do this. But at that time, to achieve really long travel, people were kind of experimenting with different radical ways of achieving them. And I was a little bit concerned with building really long shocks because of the shaft velocities involved. In other words, when you have a shock that's on a swing arm, it's moving, if it's in the middle of the bar, the shock is actually moving at half the speed. It's not just is it moving half the distance, but it's also moving half the speed of the shock that's mounted on the wheel at a 1-to-1. I was worried about trying to control fluid flow that fast. It's kind of like taking a syringe and trying to, push fluid out of the syringe. If you push the plunger slowly, you can push it. No, it feels real easy to move. You try to move it fast, and all of a sudden it doesn't want to go. So that, resistance where they become real speed sensitive is difficult to work with. We've figured out ways around that through a couple of decades of experimentation, but at that time with the technology, with the shock technology that we had, it was a little more difficult. And then a couple of other things that Extreme had that I guess were historically significant that maybe have kind of been lost in the shuffle, but that truck was actually one of the first trucks, period, not just monster trucks, but one of the very first trucks ever to have bypass shocks. Right. Lance King came up with the design while he was still at Custer for these bypass tubes, and we discussed it extensively. And he actually built the first set they ever built, and packed them up, put them on a plane, and flew them out to my shop. We put them on the truck, and he hung out with us for a few days to help try to dial the thing in because he was very curious. And that we had to make some changes to them even while we were doing testing. So that was kind of a whole new technology. And then beyond that, it also had air bumps, which have become popular since then. But back at that time, that was a pretty unique thing. The little 6-inch travel bump stops.
that truck's shocks are notably mounted more center mast on that truck compared to some of the others where it's mounted like right around the middle of the wheel.
Yes, that truck was designed that way for a few reasons. Like I said, some of it was motion ratio because I was trying to slow the shaft speed down on the shocks. Another reason that I wanted to move them from over the axles is that if I was going to mount these big shocks over the axles, it meant that the chassis had to be much longer and heavier, I thought, where the shocks would attach, especially because of the long wheelbase. That meant the chassis would be overall a lot bigger and heavier. The chassis on Extreme, even though the wheelbase was really long, like 155 inch, maybe 157, depending on how we had it adjusted, but the chassis was actually really short. What you see on the ends were really outriggers that were not designed. They were kind of disposable pieces. They were designed to be relatively lightweight. That truck, as big and long as it looked, was actually very light. We had to add quite a bit of ballast to meet the 9,500 pound weight limit for the Penda series. That thing weighed probably 8,800, 8,700, somewhere around there, and it didn't even have particularly highly cut tires. So it was pretty light.
That's also something you bring up that I think may have gotten lost over time because they've always been kind of referred to since the mid-'90s as 10,000 pounds, maybe the early '90s. A lot of the trucks were running down underneath easily 9,500, but that truck was a lot lighter than it appeared.
Yet, maximum was in the mid 8,000 pound range with uncut Goodyears. That thing could have been super light. It could have been in the very low very low, close to, I would say with modern tire technology and cut right, that thing probably could have been 8,200, somewhere in that range.
Now, moving up through the '90s, you seem to kind of taken a step back from the monster trucks, approaching Overkill Evolution. What went on for you in that industry between Extreme and Overkill Evolution?
I still stayed involved in trucks. I own a company that does custom trucks, and also I was still involved and still very much aware of everything that was going on and within the industry. I was. It's not too long after that I was joined the board of the Monster Truck Racing Association and still kept pretty much aware of where the technologies were going and everything. So it wasn't like I was completely out of it. I would say I was just kind of like on a hiatus. I didn't really necessarily know at what point I was going to jump back in, but I wanted to be prepared when I did. And the reasons for getting out were that I saw the change. I definitely saw the change that was coming. I was a very competitive person. I wanted to go racing, and that's where my mindset was at that time, because that's the way I grew up viewing monster trucks. But having stepped away from it for a while and kind of looking at it from a spectator standpoint, I kind of came to terms with the fact that we changed into something entirely new. I was trying to fit it into a box. I was trying to fit monster trucks into a box that would sit next to a drag race car. Essentially kind of pigeonholed it into being something that I was familiar with when I grew up. But monster trucks kind of became their own thing. They're not drag cars, and they're not off-road race trucks, and they're their own animal. And once I came to terms with the fact that freestyle is the prime motivator. That's what's putting fans in seats. as competitive as we are, maybe behind the wheel, that's not necessarily the thing that pulls spectators. I guess you could look at, off-road racing. There are guys that spend enormous amounts of money building, these off-road race trucks and multi-million-dollar off-road race teams, and then, they've got nothing for any sort of, spectatorship. They don't, it's not quite the same. They're doing it for the love of the competition, not for making the sport into something big. It's kind of a little bit more self-serving. Monster trucks, the popularity has reached a point way beyond what I think we could ever have expected. I never thought you would see these sold-out stadiums all over the world, and so I think you got to give credit to where credit's due in terms of raising that popularity. There were some key individuals that saw where it could go, and they kind of made some corrections in our direction that we may not have been totally on board with at the time, but in hindsight, we may not may not have been having this conversation had it not been for the vision that these individuals had. So once I came to terms with that, I said, okay, I've got to conform to this new paradigm of what a monster truck is. So where I had been totally in the racing column, lightweight, what can we do to go from point A to point B as quick as absolutely possible and keep that truck rolling on the ground as much as possible. Now it was, how big can we go? What's it going to take to hold together on a weekly basis? And everything. So the design principles that went into Evo were completely different. I went from trying to build the 8,000 pound or maybe even sub 8,000 pound truck to Evo's easily 12. It's not light in any way, shape, or form, but it's what it takes to survive in that environment. We were hitting obstacles that would have been unimaginable, even maybe 10 years ago might have been unimaginable, much less back when we were running Panda. It's a completely different world.
It's interesting you bring that up. Do you think the lack of preparedness for the popularity to bloom more with the fans than just as racers has driven the trucks, finally maybe slowed down the leaps in technology to a place where you're going to see more experimentation with what you've got before you make the next big jump?
No, I actually think the opposite. I think what happened, and I had a conversation with Mike Wales. Mike Wales was a great guy. He really had a vision. Also, I think a lot of what we see, he's responsible for too. He's a great historically significant person in our industry. And I had a conversation with him probably 10 years ago, easily. It was right after. Actually, no, I ran into him at SEMA in Las Vegas, and I told him I had been to World Finals, the Monster Jam World Finals that year, and it was a spectacular show at that, for that period. And I told him, man, how are you going to top this event next year? And he goes, I have no idea. He goes, every time we think we've gone as far as we can go, we go further. They come out with some new move or some new, capability. And back at that time, the industry was, in that circle, was pretty dominated by, Tom Mintz and Dennis Anderson. You could predict, I think it was fairly predictable who was going to be in the semifinals and racing, and you knew who I think you could pretty much pick out who was going to be in the top 5 in freestyle.
Right.
And in our conversation, I told Mike, I said, Tom, as good as he is, and Dennis is as good as he is, they're at the pinnacle of the industry. They're at the top. Their room to improve is X amount. So all these guys below, they've got a lot of room to improve, and they're going to learn from these guys. They're going to start nipping at their heels before long. And I said, how are you going to be able to judge this when the performances start becoming almost imperceptibly different? In other words, when everybody's on the same level. And we talked about it, and I think that day came. Now it's completely unpredictable. Who could ever have predicted that Overkill Evolution would win World Finals freestyle? That's just absolutely. I would have been the first one to tell you that'll never happen. It can't happen. It's just your odds of hitting the jackpot in Vegas on a slot machine are enormously better than going to Vegas and winning World Finals. So it has kind of, I think, forced some people to look at this. People that have a vested interest in the future of monster trucks, I think, are looking at this and understanding that for there to be more longevity in this, we have to be looking to the future. We're not looking to next season or maybe even the season after that. We're looking, what are we going to do to be relevant 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And the only way that I believe that's going to happen is an investment in next generation technologies that lend themselves or allow us to get to an entirely new level of performance. Right now, just a couple of years ago, Tom Mintz pulling the first backflip was just, holy cow, that's just unbelievable, and it was viewed as more a stunt. It wasn't part of the performance, and now it's commonplace. It's everybody, like, how many guys are going to do backflips tonight? And, we talk about it in, show meeting and things like that, and it's just not that, it's not such a big deal anymore. And there are other moves that I think you're going to start seeing that become, commonplace. And again, for us to reach the next level is, I think we're rapidly approaching the limits of what the current technology is going to allow us to do. The other thing that we have to be very, very conscious of the fact that every time we improve the reliability of the truck, we're shifting that fuse around. It used to be spindles. If you went too big, you'd break a wheel off. Okay, so we manufacture these, billet spindles and harden, better materials, and now the wheels don't fall off. So now what's the next thing that breaks? And as we keep improving these components, we're moving that fuse around, and the last thing we want to do is make the driver the fuse. Right, and that's the thing. That's the kind of thing that keeps us up at night. The guys on the Monster Truck Racing Association board, and the guys at at Feld Motorsports that are in charge of this. We spend a lot of time thinking about things like that. We want to go out and put on a good show, but we don't want to hurt drivers either. So I think starting to design the trucks to where they have crash zones and things like that allow some of that energy to be dissipated. And again, there are a lot of things that have evolved throughout the years in terms of driver safety that the public never sees. The spectators don't necessarily understand or see from the stands anyway. But inside the cab, they're probably more different inside the cab than they appear from the outside. The seats is a huge leap in technology. There was an injury that occurred this past weekend with a driver, and from what we've been able to discern, it appears that a lot of it may very well have been related to I would say, by today's standards, somewhat of an antiquated seat technology. Even belts, the lap belts and harnesses that we use with the ratchets and all that allow us to strap in very securely, and all the different safety features built into the cab, they really protect the driver. But again, no matter what we do there, we don't want to reach a point where the drivers feel that, well, there's, no matter what I do, I'm safe, so, I can go out and recklessly do stunts that, oh, guess what, we forgot that this, because one thing that the Monster Truck Racing Association has been discussing over the past, probably over the last year, we've been really focusing on a lot more over the last couple of months, but after first quarter, we went back and started reviewing a lot of the really serious crashes that we saw and trying to do a little bit of analysis of cage failures, when there were bad crashes, flips, rollovers, and then we looked at what seems to be working and what seems to not be working. Because we feel that we really need to update some of the specifications regarding cage design to try to protect the drivers. Because, one thing that I think we've found is that, or should I say that has stood out, is the unpredictability of the damage. We tend to, I think people tend to think linear. They think, up, down, left, right, forward, back. They don't think in angular forces. So when we look at these crashes, we've seen that, wow, the cage was designed to be really strong in this axis, but we never even took it into account that what if the force comes from over here? And it's, the trucks don't just flop over on their roofs anymore, go, back over front. They take hits in every most unpredictable direction. I think, unfortunately, we got to see that on Evo. Our crash at World Finals was pretty spectacular, and it spooked us, but, Mikey came on the radio within, a couple of seconds of the landing, and he, so I knew he was okay. But that was yet another indication that, wow, you never expect a truck to land on its roof from that high up. Fortunately, the design proved itself very well, and the truck sustained zero damage. I mean, it could have been right back onto the tires and kept going. There was no cage damage whatsoever. Mikey hurt his leg because where he landed upside down, his legs kicked what would be the top of the I guess the footwell, and hit one of the tubes, and he thought he had broken his leg. His leg was hurting really bad, and that's what took him a while to get him out of the truck. But again, we learned from that. We go, okay, well, we never thought about needing padding in that location, but it can happen. So now we got to look at that, and so we learn from our mistakes, or we learn from the things we see. We got to be observant, but we want to be proactive. I don't want to be reactive. I don't want to wait till, okay, let's see what happened here and let's keep that from happening. We need to be a little bit more proactive and think this through. Well, what are the potential things that could happen that maybe haven't happened yet? But let's do what we can to keep that day from ever coming.
You mentioned going into that truck with a completely different design plan. What are some of the different things you're able to talk about that you put into that truck? And I know there's a ton of stuff.
Yeah, I don't want to get into too much detail, but there was a lot of time spent on the design. It may look, I had CRD build the cage, the top half, and then we put our own twists on the certain areas of the truck. There are areas that are not typical, and the geometry of the entire package in a number of different areas is different. We were testing some ideas. We have a whole lot of things coming down the pike. We've got 4 or 5 new features that we want to incorporate little by little, but it's a little bit difficult because, when you're running week after week, and especially like the television series, reliability is very important. So we can't experiment too much, but at the same time, there are certain technologies that we know have a lot of, I think, a lot of potential value for the overall performance of the truck. We're really looking at next generation. We really want to be the test bed for what the future will bring. And it's a kind of a fine line we're going to be walking, but I think you may see Evo 2.0 in the not too distant future. We kind of went with what we knew was going to work in a lot of areas because, again, I had been out for a long time. We had commitments that we had to live up to. We couldn't afford to come up short on those commitments. We needed the truck to be reliable, and we didn't. I learned from my mistakes with with Extreme, that I didn't want to be too radically different in the first shot. But there are other technologies that we know we're going to incorporate.
As far as Mikey as a driver, how do you feel about turning the wheel over to him?
There's no one I would rather have working for me. We mesh really, really well. Not only is he a fantastic driver, he listens. He gives you good feedback. I can't speak highly enough of him. From his driving, as a person, he's intelligent. I think he represents me very well. I can't say enough. Couldn't ever have dreamed of having a better driver. There were over the years, as I was approaching the idea of building, there were a few people that were kind of in the mix for being behind the wheel, and when I partnered with Mike Waters, Mikey was the logical choice to put at that point, and I'm really happy that it went that way. Really, really happy. I never could have imagined when I met Mikey when he was 2 weeks old. I never could have ever dreamed back then that he'd be driving for me today.
Now, not to dwell on the past, but is there anything you'd like to see maybe come back in terms of format from the old days? Maybe not in technology, but that could mesh well with what we see now.
I think that things go in cycles. I do believe that we will see monster truck racing become more of a draw at some point. It would be really cool to have that type of racing environment again. I mean, we do have it to some degree. It's just different than what we're, if we're trying to compare it to the racing series of the past, Camel Mud and Monsters or the Panda series or anything, or even, TNT. There was a specific format of racing, and I think we tend to gravitate towards the format. But what we're doing, even through the Fox Sports 1 tour with Monster Jam, the racing we were doing, I mean, everybody was trying. It was by no means that anything staged or anything. Everybody's shooting for that win, and Adam won this year. He was on rails all year. He was very consistent. It was a very deserved win, but Tom was right in there. Damon was right in there. So I mean, it was fun. It definitely reminded me a lot of the Penda days. It's just that was a little bit more. I don't know. I guess the way it was that the shows revolved around that. Today, I think they really still kind of revolve around the freestyle. Not necessarily that the promotion company is necessarily making the focus. I think it's the fans that kind of push that. I don't think that we necessarily rush through any part. I think both parts of the show are given equal attention. It just seems as though people tend to focus, or the fans tend to focus on the freestyle stuff, which, it's exciting. I'm not going to deny that. I think, I was, a late comer to it, but it's an integral part of the show, and it is what I think primarily puts fans in the seats.
Has it changed your opinion, having been there now on a tour week to week and seeing those freestyles live at each major event that you've been at?
Yeah, this year was the first time that we did all stadiums. I mean, we were in big stadiums every week, and with the best of the best, and we got to see some amazing performances and some spectacular crashes, and I think that's kind of really made my focus on how can we ensure the durability of the trucks, and how can we ensure the safety of the drivers, and how do we ensure the safety of the track personnel. There's a lot of times we tend to focus on driver safety, but realistically it's the crews and the track personnel that are probably at greatest risk. They're the ones that are working around the vehicles. The drivers, at least, they're inside of a cage, but if you're working on the truck, you have to be very, very situationally aware. You've got to be aware of what you're doing. You've got to be aware of what's going on around you. If someone else fires a truck up or is moving, that's why the track personnel are very, very strict about, hey, don't be on the floor when the truck's moving. Sometimes it may seem like inconvenient, like, hey, I need to make a repair, and I can't get to my truck because they won't let us on the floor. Well, they do that for very legitimate reasons. They're looking out for you. They're looking out to keep us from, making bad choices. Don't put yourself in harm's way. Being safe is more important than, making an adjustment to your truck. So we want to be the safest. I'm a firm believer that we are the safest of all motorsports. I think our record is the best of any motorsport. The fewest injuries. I mean, any injury is unfortunate, but we've been in front of a lot of people for many, many years with a relatively minimal number of injury, and we want to improve on that record. We want to be as proactive as possible to ensure that into the future.